We got the Hyperthrive Athletic guys, so they are a company based in Sacramento. They do some really great work, especially in the realm of like throwing athletes, baseball players. So they're crushing the game up there. So I wanted to bring you guys some good content, specifically pertaining to throwing athletes, because this is something that I don't go into very much with my basketball stuff. So first of all, thank you guys for being here.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having us.
So maybe give a quick background on your story, because we got 3 brothers running the company. That's pretty unique. It's a story that I've never heard before.
Yeah.
So how did that come about?
Man, it kind of happened organically. It's not something we ever planned when we were young. All of us kind of went into college with different routes we were choosing. I went in as a graphic design major and then kind of slowly transitioned into kinesiology when I found out I hated being on a computer.
Yeah.
And then, so Nolan, you were doing physical therapy and then transitioned out of that. And Aaron was kinesiology, but was a little bit
studying baseball and partying.
Studying
Nice.
baseball.
There you go.
And then, we all kind of went our separate routes after college. Aaron was in Texas. Nolan was actually in South America in Santiago, Chile. And I was bouncing around doing internships. And then I think, was it 3 years ago, we all kind of moved back to Sacramento, started training athletes, and it's just grown organically from there. And we moved into our own standalone facility 2 years ago. So that was the first time Hyperthrive Athletics was, standing on its own feet in its own building. And then since then, it's just been growing. And it's been an awesome journey. It's definitely unique being a family business and working with our brothers, but I mean, I wouldn't want it any other way, and we have an awesome relationship. So it's fun for us and for our athletes because it is a family environment.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. And so you guys are doing a little bit of every sport, and is it mainly baseball, or is it all baseball?
Yeah, so we're 90% baseball. We have a handful of other athletes to work with, but for the most part, we're all overhead throwing athletes. So we do have some general population stuff, but for the most part, 60 to 70% of our business is overall is baseball players or softball athletes as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. And so you guys do group sessions, semi-private, private. How's kind of the structure of your business?
Small group setting.
Small group.
So yeah, you can expect to be with a group. If you're an athlete, it's probably a group of like 3 to 6. Nice. And then our adult fitness groups are usually a little bit bigger. Mm-hmm. But yeah, small group based.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Awesome. So these guys spoke at the conference up at the Kings facility with Ramsey Nijum. So that's how I initially met them, and they were doing some really good stuff that I've never opened my eyes to because I don't spend much time studying baseball athletes, obviously. But it was crazy because like our presentations had so much carryover.
Yeah.
I was talking about jumping, and they were talking about baseball and pitching, and there were so many concepts that carried over. So they talk about gas leg versus brake leg. And for me, I had very similar concepts. I actually adopted that terminology, gas leg and brake leg.
Love that.
You have one leg that is, I was calling it the force leg. It's really producing most of the force, deeper knee bends. And then that other leg is your block leg, which you guys call your brake leg. And that's a little bit more rigid, and that's decelerating you. And so like pitching and jumping actually have a lot of similarities. Since I never talk about pitching, football or quarterbacks, overhead athletes, can we talk a little bit about like what are the main keys when it comes to shoulder health, when it comes to staying healthy? If you had to give a coach or an athlete advice on how to keep your shoulders healthy, what are some of the meat and potatoes there?
Yeah, so definitely the meat and potatoes is strengthening the rotator cuff, definitely. Mm-hmm. And I think when we're talking about strengthening the rotator cuff, first we do it isometrically. I think you need to do, especially early in the off season, we do a lot of long isometric holds just to build some tissue resiliency. And then from there, also one thing that we really focus on is a lot of people are so focused on the shoulder as far as overhead throwing athletes, and they're not focused enough on the T-spine, right? The T-spine and its relationship to the scaps. So when we talk about, a lot of people want to talk about like scapular rhythm or scapular mobility. Well, we have to appreciate that the scaps are just sitting on the rib cage, right? And the rib cage controlled by the T-spine and how it moves, how it can extend and rotate. So really, if an athlete is what we would say has poor shoulder mobility, poor overhead mobility, first we need to look at the T-spine and how that's moving, because a lot of the times that's going to be kind of the big rock that's holding up the scaps in the shoulder from moving better in the long run. And so I think that's where you need to focus on the athlete's ability to rotate and extend and flex through the T-spine, because that's what's truly going to deliver the shoulder blade, which is going to actually deliver the shoulder.
Right.
So I think a lot of people, they're going out there when we're talking about shoulder health, and it's just like J-bands, right? You see all the athletes out there, external rotation, internal rotation, okay, we're good, right? And then we're ready to go. But nobody's, doing kettlebell Turkish get-ups or windmills or even, something like a T-spine, I'm blanking. Like
bench mobility.
Bench T-spine mobility. Anything where we can get a little bit more flexion, extension, and rotation through the T-spine, I think that's going to be kind of the hinge that swings the door as far as shoulder health. But then from there, again, just strengthening the shoulder girdle, strengthening the rotator cuff. And I think that's where you get more into the kind of traditional band exercises. But I think one key component that's missed by a lot of coaches is focusing on the T-spine and how that affects what the shoulders are doing.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And so you're focusing on mainly like T-spine mobility, or is there like T-spine strengthening that they need, or is it like they're already too strong and stiff up there and you just want that mobility?
I think it's definitely a beautiful combination of both, right? And in the past, what we would have done to maybe get some better, upward rotation of the scaps is something like a wall slide or a Y raise, something like that. And what we found is, we would spend a ton of time with an athlete who had poor overhead mobility. We would spend all offseason really focused on those kind of drills, like serratus slides, rollouts, anything like that. But is that matching the force or the speed necessary to actually get into an overhead throwing position?
Right.
Probably not, right? So how do we add some speed or some force into that equation so that we can get a little bit more carryover into something that requires those high levels of forces and speeds like pitching? So one thing that we've actually included a lot more of is like kettlebell skill work. With the Turkish get up, obviously that's going to require a T-spine to extend, rotate, but it's also going to add some force into the equation, because now an athlete is having to react to whatever that kettlebell is doing. So it's going to have to stabilize at the same time as getting mobility, right? So it's a beautiful combination of strength and stability and flexibility, mobility, kind of all combined into one. So that's where in the past we would have used drills like those, serratus wall slides or like the Y raises. But I think we still use those. I think those still have a place in creating context for athletes and what positions they should be getting into. But in order to create carryover into something as dynamic as throwing, I think you need to look a little bit further as a coach into how much, force these athletes are putting through that shoulder.
Right.
And how can what we do in the gym more positively affect that.
Right.
And also, too, I think from a programming perspective and exercises that our athletes are doing, whether you're looking at like a push-up or really any row variation or like landmine overhead pressing, it's making sure that like you're intentional about that movement, like everything you're doing, making sure you're kind of focused on what that shoulder blade is doing as you get into overhead position, or if we're doing a push-up, getting a lot of protraction through that push-up at the top of the movement. Same thing with our row variations, just being intentional about what we're doing with those movements.
Okay, for
and
sure.
I think that's a great point, is like every exercise in the gym can be considered arm care, right? Like if we are weak anywhere in the body and we're throwing, like we have a lot of kids who are not that strong, but because of their natural ability and the time they've spent really optimizing their ability to throw, it's putting a ton of stress on the shoulder, but their body is just not ready to withstand that, right? But if we can get a kid a little bit stronger in a split squat position and maybe get his core to actually decelerate a little bit more than his shoulder girdle having to do it, it's automatically going to put less stress on the shoulder. So I think a lot of people are so focused on being like sport specific and working just on the rotator cuff, when in fact, like if I get an athlete a little bit stronger in a split squat, or if I do, get them doing some chops and just basic core work, stuff that's going to allow them to decelerate a little bit more efficiently, that in itself is going to take a lot of stress off the shoulder. And so maybe it's not the shoulder and the rotator cuff strength that's the issue. Maybe it's our inability to decelerate the rest of our body is putting too much stress on that shoulder in the first place.
Right. That makes a ton of sense. Goes back to that concept of like train humans first, athletes second, baseball players third. Like there's a lot of value to that, where most people think like train the baseball player.
Yeah.
Well, what about them as a human? What about them as an overall athlete? So you just talked about decelerating with the core, and it just triggered a different question in my mind. So popular ideas in the strength and conditioning world is, I've always loved, anti-rotation stuff. And now a lot of people are coming out and saying like, you lose your ability to move your pelvis, and, it kills your ability to rotate. Do you guys use anti-rotation core work? And what would you say to somebody who says that it's a bad thing for athletes?
So I think a very important thing as far as strength, or like, let's just say strength, right? I think strength is the ability to hold positions, right? Like the ability to hold position under load. And so if I have a 12-year-old coming into the gym for the first time, I can't tell him brace your core, right? I have to show him how to do that. I have to create some context for that athlete. And I'm not going to do that by just having him do med ball throws, right? Like that is where a lot of people say, we have the inability to counter rotate or create separation from the hip and the thorax. Yes, that's important for an athlete, but one, for safety in the gym, I need to create context on how to actually create stiffness. Like stiffness is not everything when it comes to athletics, but stiffness it plays a pretty strong role in creating safety within the weight room. Sure. So I think when we're working with youth athletes, or just even any athlete in general, like we have to create some context with anti-rotation, anti-extension exercises. But I love when people like hate on one category, but like it's not like I'm only doing anti-rotation or only anti-extension. It is a very small part of the entire picture of what we're doing, right? So I think you can't get too wrapped up in it where I'm only doing anti-rotation and only anti-extension, because again, like we talked about, is that matching the necessity or the needs that the body is going to have to meet when it comes to sport? I don't think Palloff presses are going to do it when I throw an athlete on the mound who can throw 95 miles an hour, right? That's not preparing him for his sport. But early in the offseason or early in his career, I think allowing him to create that context, it's a necessity. So I don't think you can completely disregard the use of anti-rotation or anti-extension. I think it's a big part of any program, but it's definitely not the entirety of what we do for our core work.
Yeah, I definitely think it's one of the first places we start as far as core work goes.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is it? Proximal stability equals
distal
athleticism.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, and even too, like taking it to, and this isn't like proper for when somebody first comes in, but like taking it to an advanced level, doing like ballistic med ball catches where an athlete's standing laterally, we're here, and we throw a med ball and he has to catch it and stick. I mean, that, has a lot of application as far as stuff that transfer to the field or the court.
And like we talked about, like what you said, train the human, then the athlete, then the baseball player.
Yeah.
Okay, what is the core's role just as a human? It's to protect the spine.
Protect the spine.
So if we're completely, like, I don't care about a baseball player if they have a hurt low back. You know what I mean? Like, if I can't, like, check that box off that I know this person's going to be safe training, then what are we doing having them do explosive med ball throws?
Right, 100%. And I also don't get the idea where these coaches are thinking that it like can ruin your movement patterns. Like if that's all you do for 24 hours a day, then sure, it's going to influence your other movement patterns. But if it's like a small little piece of your program, it's not going to all of a sudden kill your ability to dissociate.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't understand when trainers are like hypersensitive to doing certain movements, because they think it's going to like ruin your sports skill.
Yeah. 3 sets of 10 per side on a Palloff press isn't going to make much of a difference in the scope of things.
Right. Especially when they're in a certain position at class all day. Like those could influence you because you live in those positions.
Yeah. Well, they're also playing outside and playing basketball and climbing trees for 3 hours a day. So I mean, that's a lot more stimulus than that one set of Palloff presses.
Anytime somebody brings that up, I'm like, yeah, but my athletes walk to class every day. Are they going to become slower?
Yeah.
Are they going to learn like not to sprint because they're walking?
Yeah, they have a backpack hanging off one side of their back. They're stabilizing that. That's anti-rotation right there.
Right.
Well, and also too, when they step into the gym and do a squat or a deadlift, I mean that's anti pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Right.
So
100%. Okay, so we talked about kind of what you guys like to do. Talk about isometrics. You talk about taking care of the rotator cuff, also not looking at that as like the main thing. Let's train the core and let's train the lower body, and it takes stress off the shoulder. How about stuff that you don't do? So like, is there anything that you say, hey, this overhead athlete, we should not be doing overhead presses, we should not be doing pull-ups, we should not be doing bench press? I know a lot of coaches get away from certain exercises. What's your stance on that?
So not avoiding the question, saying it depends. It's always going to depend. And I think when it comes to overhead athletes, there's been over the last decade this definite idea of like overhead athletes shouldn't work out overhead, right? And I think that kind of came from maybe people on more of like the physical therapy end of things, where we were trying to be really cute with our athletes. And I think it's a pendulum swing, right? Like with anything else, like it's gonna be, okay, nobody's doing any pressing at all. No, like back in the day, baseball players didn't lift upper body, right? Mm-hmm. And then it was like, okay, we're adding a little bit. Now people are like 5-3-1 bench, you know, and then it's going to swing and it's going to find something right in the middle. And I think that's where we try to be. But I think it's foolish to say, okay, this athlete is an overhead athlete, so we need to avoid overhead strength. Like that doesn't really make much sense to me. And I think as far as safety in the gym, yes, if an athlete can't get into an overhead position safely, we should probably avoid like axially loading that position, but there's ways that we can get around it just through exercise selection. Right. So like a landmine press where I'm in a half kneeling position where it doesn't force me to be actually entirely overhead, where I'm getting, 45 degrees out. That's perfect. Like we're avoiding the risk there, but we're still getting the same reward of having them press overhead. Right. And I just think, if it's like saying, okay, sprinters have a high chance of getting a hamstring injury, so we're not going to work hamstrings in the gym. Yeah. Like when you put it into other contexts like that, like it just doesn't make much sense. Right. And I think it's because people thought, and I think it's with even early in my career, like when you work with your first professional athlete, it's like, okay, I'm kind of going to pamper this guy, like because we're afraid of injury, which is something as a coach I think you have to work through, but you still have to load that athlete and prepare them for the sport. Yep. Otherwise they're going to get hurt in the sport, and then that's still your fault. Yeah, yeah. That's like, a good way to think about it. Yeah, you're just prolonging it. Yep. There's a lot of facilities that will try to make guys feel really good. And so their workout ends up kind of being just like this long, extended warm-up. They get a light sweat, but they're afraid, like you're saying, they're afraid to load. Yeah. And then the guys go get hurt in season because they weren't properly prepared. Like in an NBA season, you can't really load guys through season. It's more maintenance. So in the off season, that's our time to really put some load on them and make them durable. But there's facilities that are afraid to do that. Yeah, and I think on the flip side of that is like something like pull-ups. Like pull-ups are getting a really bad rap. I mean, over the last decade in baseball as well. And I think there was like a long string of lat injuries, right, that I think prevented athletes or prevented facilities from wanting to do anything that would make someone lat dominant, right? But when we look at the lat, like being an extremely strong internal rotator, like, yes, an athlete is throwing 95, his lat is going to be working really hard. If somebody runs really fast, it puts them at a higher risk of blowing out a hammy. Like it's just what comes with having that ability to be that explosive. But again, like if the lat needs to be resilient to those kind of forces, why would I not load it? Right. And load it safely and load it smartly. But actually Cressy posted a tweet the other day that was great, and when he was talking about lat training, it was we need to teach the lat how to not only fire but relax. And I think that's where the issue comes up, is if you're not doing something on the other side of things to, like, we do a ton of TRX lat hangs, split stance lat hangs, make sure guys are foam rolling their lats, just because, obviously we don't want somebody like super lat dominant and pulling down. But at the end of the day, again, our job is to prepare athletes for the sport. And I think if you're avoiding something like, a pull-up because you're afraid of them getting lat dominant, I think you're actually kind of harming them in the long run. Right. Yeah, there's always going to be situations where there's a performance injury conflict. And so it's like, to do this, to perform at a high level, they need this. Yeah. But then the physical therapist or the over-conservative strength coach goes, but that might lead to an injury. But it's like, if we want them to be safe, let's have them sit at home on the couch. Like, that's much safer. That's where they're going to be if they can't go out and perform. Do some water aerobics. Yeah, exactly. Like, let's sit on the couch and do water aerobics because we're afraid of injuries. They're going to be on the couch pretty soon because they can't perform at the highest level. Yeah, and like Max talks about all the time, he goes, a little bit of bad equals some good. So it's like, deep squats, are they bad for your knees? Well, it's higher forces on your knees. There's much more torque on your knees. That's an opportunity for you to adapt. So that's a good thing long term, as long as it's loaded and it's progressed at the right rate. So a lot of people see things, they go, oh no, that's bad. Well, a little bit of bad can be good if you actually load it the right way. So, okay, talked about core training. Working with rotational athletes,
how much of that comes from core training? How much, like, your typical rotation, your cable rotations, like you said, your chops, how much of that is going to come from more dynamic work of like med ball type stuff?
Yeah.
Is there a balance of you need a little bit of both to be the best rotational athlete or the most powerful rotational athlete?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a combination of being able to be explosive and create, some high power outputs, but then being able to decelerate for a baseball player is extremely important. We do a ton of med ball work. Like at the beginning of almost every single session, we're doing med ball work. I love that for a lot of different reasons. One, to teach intent. Like I think a lot of baseball players, especially young guys, depending on the coach they're working with, like you see some dudes swing at a young age and it looks like they're performing like a rehearsed dance routine, like they're trying to like hit certain positions. And I think if you put like a med ball in a kid's hand who has been playing baseball for a decent amount of time, they're usually great rotators. Even if you'll get a kid who you try to get him to an A skip and it's like baby deer, right? But you put a med ball in his hands and you say throw it against the wall, it's going to look fairly good.
Right.
But I think taking the bat out of their hands and taking away the fear of like a bad swing and just telling them throw it into the wall as hard as you can, teach them how to create some intent there. That's extremely important. I think it's a benefit that's often overlooked with med ball work. But then as far as rotational athletes and stability on the other side of things, I don't know if it's a quote I heard or if it's just something I heard along the way, but kinetic energy is like money. It's not about how much you make, it's about how much you save. So we can create all this force in the lower body, but it doesn't mean anything unless it gets to the implement, right? Like unless it gets to the bat or the ball. And I think often overlooked is the lower body's ability to decelerate, like we talked about the gas and the brake leg, right? And that front leg for pitchers and hitters is so important to create a really quality braking mechanism so that we can transfer that force through the core, through the upper body, and into the hands. And so we spend a lot of time creating strength and stability in split stance positions, because when you look at baseball players, everything they do is in a split stance position. And even further than that, I think a lot of people will look at a pitcher and it's like, yeah, they have to brake coming linearly down the mound, like straight at the catcher or at the plate, right? But then we also have to decelerate that rotation. And so that front leg has to not only decelerate kind of linearly, but it has to be able to decelerate the hips. Because when you look at like the segmentation of a swing or a pitch, like one fires and then it's the next and then it's the next. So it's the deceleration of one unit that creates the acceleration of the other. It's like a whip, right? Yeah. So if I have a whip and none of it decelerates, it's just going to float to the ground. Or like if you watch, I think it's easier because it's slower. Like if you watch somebody fly fish, they're going to whip and then pull it back, and that's what creates the whip that actually finally finishes it, right? But without that first deceleration, we don't get that whipping effect. So if the lower body doesn't have the ability to decelerate, it's not going to as efficiently get up to the implement. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. I like that. I like visualizing it as the whip. That makes a lot of sense. So you were implementing this in the med ball drills that you were doing. So you guys coached them different than I've ever seen, because normally, even if it's like on the run or two-step, whatever, you're building up speed and then you kind of just keep going.
Yeah,
right.
I hate seeing that online.
And so you guys started doing like the break with that leg. I like that a lot. Describe that.
I think it's such a powerful movement and it's so fast that you can't coach it, right? Like, or you can, but you have to coach it in a different way than you would with other movements where it's a little bit slower. Because it's so dynamic, like you can't sit there and give a kid an internal cue like lock out that front knee. It's too fast for them to do it, right? But I think it's easy to give a kid like a visualization. So one thing we'll describe a lot is, imagine you're riding a bike as hard as you can and you run straight into a curb. Like what's the bike and what are you going to do? It's going to topple straight over the top. Or if you hit the front brake, what's it going to do? So you want to think about that front leg, like hit the brakes. So a lot of times that's all I'll say to an athlete is just hit the brakes. But another way that we like to create context is through isometrics. So isometrics in a split stance before we do our med ball work. So we'll have kids do like an overcoming isometric hold into pins and put them into the positions we want. So where there's just barely a little bit of flexion in that front knee. So that's kind of the position I want them to be hitting when they're decelerating, right? And I'll have them hold an overcoming isometric hold in that position. I think that does two things. One, it potentiates the front leg. And then two, it's going to create some context so they can actually feel what that position feels like. Because in an isometric, it's like, how do we slow something down to the slowest point possible? It's an isometric, right?
Yeah.
So if I want to really create context on how I want an athlete to feel, I think an isometric is like the
sure.
go-to there.
For
and
sure.
so we'll do that and then immediately go into our med ball throws. And we've found that it creates a lot of a really good carryover for our athletes.
And also, too, I think it's a little bit, if you are working with baseball, softball, a quarterback, maybe even a tennis player who rotates a lot in their sport already, I feel like they get it a little bit easier than if you maybe working with a basketball player or, some other sport, volleyball, something like that. So I think, we always start in a static position where their feet are planted and then they go into the rotation and then we start adding movement. So I think if, to help an athlete get it, obviously we want to start them in a static position and just let them feel it and like feel that front side bracing. Mm-hmm. From there we can, start doing where we like walk into it or almost do like a crow hop type thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would kind of do like the crow hop, and then you guys do like fast approach stuff where you would like,
because
almost like run into it.
Yeah, they're having to decelerate a little bit more momentum.
Yeah.
And I think that comes when they have a little bit more ability to do it. But I think that's where the exercise selection kind of comes into it. Like when we have a younger athlete, we'll often have them start like laterally, so facing away from the wall, and having them like, rotate into the wall laterally. Mm-hmm. And so because they're not having to stop their momentum coming linearly, it's going to allow them to create that braking mechanism without because a lot of times kids just aren't strong enough to do it, especially if you're having them run into the wall, which I see a lot of people go straight into. So that's another way to create context or just allow for them to have success right off the bat instead of throwing them straight into, you got a 20-foot run into a med ball throw, because kids just aren't going to be successful with that.
We can definitely like shoot some videos of like progressions that we use that we can
That'd
share
be
with
cool.
you guys.
Yeah, we'll add that on here. As far as like, I've always gone back and forth between a push and like a 2-arm toss.
Yeah.
Is there one that you prefer, or do each of them have certain benefits?
We do both.
Okay.
So for us, as far as, training baseball players, one's going to have a little bit more I don't want to say carryover, but one's going to be a little bit more similar to pitching or throwing, and one's going to be a little bit more similar to swinging, right? And I think both have their benefits. So even with a pitcher, I'm still going to have them do a scoop toss, just because I think, it's good to get people in different positions and have them rotate differently. But there definitely is one that more closely resembles throwing and one that more closely resembles swinging.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. But I think there's definitely a benefit to both.
Yeah, I end up just selecting whichever one's prettier, because basketball players don't know how to rotate. So I'm just like, what can you do?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Is one question. This is completely unrelated, but I've always wondered, because I've heard of stories of like CC Sabathia, and you hear a lot in the news. Does mass equal gas? Is there a correlation? And should pitchers be losing weight, or should they embrace that big body type?
Definitely, to some extent, mass equals gas. But like I said, it's only how much you can, how much you can keep. How much of that energy can you keep? And I think it's like athleticism is plays a much larger role than people often like think about pitchers. Like if you look at somebody like Bartolo Colon, like he doesn't look all that athletic, but the dude can move, right? So if it's becoming an issue in decreasing your athleticism, like you've put on weight just to put on weight and you're not moving as well just as an athlete, I think that's an issue, right? But if you have a pretty frail kid who's like 150 as a senior in high school, like it's time to put on some weight. So there's definitely, it allows you to create a little bit more momentum going down the mound, but it's also reliant on your body's ability to decelerate that, have a good braking mechanism, and your ability to transfer it up the kinetic chain. Because if you can't transfer it, then it doesn't really matter.
And also, I think from a recruiting perspective, it helps.
That's a great point.
If you look the part, it looks way better to a coach or a scout. Obviously, there's going to be a guy that's 6'3", 175 that pumps gas, and he's going to get recruited no matter what. But if you're an average player and you're, let's just say, like 5'9", 150, compared to like a dude that's 5'9", 190, like he has a better eye appeal than the skinnier kid.
Right.
So,
and
100%.
then to go on the kind of opposite side of things, like maybe someone who's a little bit overweight, like playing at a weight that's heavier than they need to be, I think if you look at like resiliency and longevity, so if I have an athlete who is like 190, but he comes in at like 220 the next year and it's not good weight, right? That is more weight that he's going to have to decelerate repetition over repetition over repetition. So if it's not lean mass that's actually helping me in my performance, really it's just putting more stress on everything that's already getting stress.
Yeah.
And if it's unnecessary, then it's like, why are we doing it?
Right. For sure. That makes a lot of sense. How about conditioning for baseball? I have some baseball friends who still tell me that they go out for super long jogs every single day. They're still running sprints every day. What is the point of doing this like longer duration stuff for baseball?
I think that comes out of the history, right? So I think if you are training baseball players for aerobic capacity, and it's just because it's what your coach made you do back in the 70s or 80s, that's not a good reason, right? And I think one thing that I try to stress to coaches is conditioning is sport specific, right? So conditioning doesn't mean that an athlete is just an aerobic beast, right? Conditioning and having proper conditioning for a basketball player is much different than being conditioned for baseball.
Yeah.
So being conditioned for your sport is contextual, right? And a baseball athlete, it's like powerful movement, 20 seconds of rest. Powerful movement, 20 seconds of rest. And that's a pitcher. That's the person who's getting the most, the most exercise or the most stress throughout a game.
Yeah.
And I think with it being such a long season, we need some aerobic capacity just so that we make sure towards the end of the season, like we're still staying healthy. I think that's really key. So I think if you're not doing any aerobic capacity work, you're probably shooting yourself in the foot when it comes to being durable throughout the season. But like the guys that are just doing long distance running and that's the only type of conditioning they're doing, I don't think you're really preparing yourself for the sport.
Yeah.
And so what we do is early in the off season, we're going to try to build some aerobic capacity. And we don't do that through long distance running. Like we've put out a lot of great articles or a lot of great videos on what we do for aerobic capacity. And I think it's also kind of tissue specific in our opinion. So we'll do a lot of that through our med ball work or med ball circuit. So it's rotational and a little bit more contextual to the sport as well. But then as the season gets closer and closer, we're pulling back on that quite a bit, right? And I think that's just because it's kind of it's going against what our priorities are for that time of the year, right?
Yeah, you have competing demands.
Exactly. Like and that's one thing that we have trouble with is like kids go back from winter break into the spring. The first thing they do, very first practice, is like you have to run a 6-minute mile or you're doing it every single day until you can. Yeah. And it's like, if I have a month and a half to prepare for the season, is that really the most beneficial or time efficient thing for me to be doing as a baseball player? Yeah. Probably not. And the same coach that told me he wanted me to put on weight over the break and come back, throwing harder or hitting the ball harder. So that's, I need to be working on my power. But you want me to be spinning the break, like focusing on trying to run a 6-minute mile when I get back. So it's just a little bit, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense when we look at it from like our perspective of understanding the physiology of it. So I think that's where it's really important for baseball coaches and baseball players to be informed and kind of take the time to study what is necessary and what is proper conditioning for a baseball player. Because again, like you don't need to be an aerobic beast, but I think as an athlete you need to be responsible for your health and take care of that early in the off season. Yeah. But when we get closer to the season, it's not really all that necessary.
Yeah, and I think also too it depends. Obviously it always depends, but on the individual. Like me as a player, when I played in college, I pitched in college, like night before my outings, and it wasn't super long duration, and I wasn't like getting my heart elevated crazy high, but like I would like to go out and maybe run a couple laps or something like that. And it was really a mindset thing for me. Is I would go out and it was almost like meditation. Like I would visualize myself pitching the next day. So I think in that context it could work. But if you're just running long duration just to do it, or like Joe said, that's what your coach did like early on, or you're using it as a conditioning test and guys are getting like shin splints and stuff, that's when it becomes a problem.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it seems like when you have a decent aerobic base, you're healthier as a human. You probably actually recover a little bit faster. Yeah. So it does make sense to have some aerobic capacity for all sports, even for like a golfer.
Yeah, just the ability to recover.
Yeah. And then also, like you guys said, towards the beginning of the off season, because if you don't have an aerobic base, that's going to influence your anaerobic work. So you can't recover in 1 minute to get back into your next set.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, is the aerobic system is what regenerates our anaerobic system, right? So if you are the type of athlete that's completely neglecting your aerobic capacity, then you're hindering your anaerobic energy system's ability to regenerate and create that power over and over and over again.
Right.
So I don't want to be that guy that's like completely anti, running or anti aerobic capacity, because I do think there's value there. I just think you need to be smart about how and when you use it.
Right.
Well, and that's another thing, like, I think sometimes where coaches fall short is they don't necessarily understand workload. And so having these kids run laps, but then putting them through a speed session like directly after it or before, they don't understand that, well, yeah, they just ran 20 sprints to second base, and then they put them through this, mile run. They don't put it all together.
Right.
And
they try to compartmentalize it.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't really understand, if they went out and did that, they'd be gassed, right?
Yeah.
But they're trying to get these kids mentally tough, and they don't really understand what physiologically it's doing to the body.
And like you talked about how you want your basketball players to get their conditioning through pickup games or on the court. We work with a couple teams, high school and college teams, whose coaches like have the right idea, and they use their practice as their conditioning session. So they'll go high tempo work while they're in practice, whether it's doing their infield work or base running or whatever the case may be, and they do it in a smart manner. And so once practice is over, their team's already got the conditioning, and they don't have to go run extra sprints or do long distance stuff.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of coaches don't understand this concept of adaptive energy. And so they think if you can get through it and you survived, we're good. We got in more total work. But what they don't understand is, like, if you just went out and pushed them aerobically, you only have so much adaptive energy. You got so much raw materials that can go towards a recovery or adaptation. And if you're also trying to adapt from your weight room work and from your skills training, that's just taking away from that adaptive energy. And so where you would normally have 10 points to pull from, now because of that aerobic work, you now have 5 points to pull from. And so then it leads to overuse injuries, and it just adds up. I think in all sports, people just need to understand what stresses they're putting their players through. And aerobic work, even though it's light, it is another stressor.
Yeah. And I think it's like a good visual to give coaches is like specific adaptation to impose demands, right?
Yeah.
And if we look at like a marathon runner, like a competitive marathon runner, okay, well, that is the adaptation to the demand that you're placing on the athlete. Do you want your baseball player to look like that?
Right.
And obviously that's an over exaggeration, but it's like a good visual, like that adaptation comes from that demand. Like that's not what we're going for.
Yeah.
And so it's, maybe you have to paint that picture for a coach so that they understand kind of the severity of what it can do when it comes to, pushing an athlete that hard.
Yeah. You know what I do in basketball? Everybody understands the term fast twitch muscle fibers.
Yes.
And so I go that route. I go, well, hey, studies show if you do too much aerobic work, you're decreasing your fast twitch. And they go, oh my gosh.
The
fast
moment
twitch?
you say fast twitch.
You're like, oh, I'm bought in. I had Dr. Andy Galpin on the podcast, and he's one of the lead researchers in this area. And he was talking about, they did a study on twins, and they were separated. One twin did nothing. The other twin went and ran like marathons. The twin that ran marathons had 50% less fast twitch muscle fibers. And this was like I think this was like a 20 or 30 year study. So it just shows like that's the perfect example of the person who didn't do the aerobic work, the person who did all the aerobic work.
Yeah.
Literally 50% less.
Yeah, speaking on some of the stuff he does, like the needles that he talks about that they have to use to get those measurements.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
I'm not going to.
He wanted me to come in, and I was like, cool, I'll do it. And then I found out how big the needle was.
Yeah.
Like, never mind.
Oh, they like pull it out of your muscle?
Yeah, it's as big as a
gnarly.
pen. So think about a pen, and they jam that in your leg. Yeah. It's nuts. And so I was going to get all of our NBA players to go. We're going to have this whole study. And then once I found that out, I'm like, they are not going to do this. Yeah. But he was telling a funny story that everybody freaks out about it. But they had like this 84-year-old grandma. And they're like, okay, this is going to hurt. They're like walking her through it slow. And she's like, I've had 5 kids. Hurry up. Like, she didn't care at all. Yet we can't get like myself to do it or an NBA player to do it.
No.
I don't like needles already, and that's normal needles. But yeah, that podcast is interesting, and he talks about that. And he's, first of all, we don't know much about fast twitch, so we always like go by what we learn. Every like 2 years, that information's all going to change. But what we do know is that you can train it, and most importantly, it's about taking away the things that go against our goal. So like there's not a lot that we can do to improve our type 2X fast twitch muscle fibers, but there's a lot that we can do to get rid of those. There was an interesting study actually. I just brought this up with Max about, it's an overshoot study. So they took this group, tested them before, tested them after, and then tested them after 3 months of detraining. So he took an untrained group, they trained for 3 months, and then they tested. They went from, I think, 9% type 2X fast twitch down to 2% right after that 3-month training period. And then after the 3 months of detraining, they overshot and they went up to 17% fast twitch. So it was the fact that they went from the couch, because when you're on the couch, you don't have a demand for endurance. And so your fibers like to go more towards that fast twitch side. As soon as you start doing any aerobic work or any like high volume strength work, your body is going to adapt to that and it becomes more efficient. More efficient is getting rid of those type 2X fast twitch and moving more towards slow twitch. And so that is probably your adaptation to most exercise in general, is decrease those type 2X and move them towards type 2A or towards slow twitch. But it's interesting because then after that detraining, they bounce back up, and they bounce back up twice what they initially had.
Yeah.
I just thought that was interesting. But it goes to show, like, hey, if you go do too much aerobic work, there's no way you're going to be able to maintain those type 2X fibers.
Yeah.
And those type 2X fibers are probably pretty important for hitting home runs.
Yeah, and I think that's it frustrates us watching trainers sometimes. It's like they're talking about putting their athletes through power work, and then you see the athletes are doing a minute-long set of med ball throws.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, okay, well, if you want to develop some power, you're completely negating what you're trying to do in the first place.
Right, 100%. How about heavy ball work? I was always intrigued by heavy ball work when I was a little kid, and I never knew if it actually worked or not. Does that ruin kids, or is that
You mean like
legit?
plyo balls, like throwing?
Like a heavy, like a pitching routine with a
Yeah.
heavy ball?
So that's something that's definitely become huge within the last decade, but it's something that's been studied for a long time, and there's definitely massive benefits to it. I mean, if you look at, track and field is a great representation of, training, because it's not like in baseball, there's a lot of other factors that go into having a great season. Like someone can have a really good off season, do everything right, and just not be like mentally in the right zone or whatever the case may be, and they just have a bad season. With track and field, like training is going to immediately affect what you do, right? It's going to immediately affect your results. And when it comes to specificity, like there's nothing in the weight room that we're going to do that's going to come close to what we're doing on the mound. It's the fastest movement in all of sports. And if you look at like shot putters have been doing heavy ball training forever, right? Or like hammer throwers, because that's the closest you can come to the sport, is like either lighter or heavier. And I think one thing, like people always want to look at it from an increased velocity standpoint, but even from like a coordination standpoint, it's really great just to do something that's heavier and lighter, right? So that the movement pattern and the I've been reading a lot of Franz Bosch, and it's like attractors versus fluctuators, right? So attractors are something in a movement that are always going to maintain. They're always going to be the same in every movement. But in sport, obviously we have to deal with reacting to different outside stimulus. And that's where our fluctuators of our movement come in. So that's what's going to change in the movement. So like a good example of it is like a swing, right? So a swing path, the path is going to stay generally the same, right? So that's an attractor. What the fluctuator is like, let's say you get an off-speed pitch, you're going to react to that. Your path is going to stay the same, but your front knee is going to bend a little bit, right? And that's going to allow us to kind of hold back and actually react to that outside stimulus. And so when you give your body just those small little changes, it's going to allow us to coordinate a little bit more effectively and learn how to kind of basically like make the attractors deeper, like the well of the attractor. So make that a more stable. So that would be like with the swing, it's a more stable movement pattern. But when we give those like small variations, that's going to allow us to react those fluctuators a little bit more efficiently.
Yeah.
So from a coordination standpoint, it's great for pitchers and for hitters, because even now they're doing like weighted bat and light bat, right? So from a coordination standpoint, great. From a velocity standpoint, there definitely can be some benefits. It's going to increase your external rotation, right, in your shoulder. And the more time we have on something, like the more time on the implement we have to accelerate, the better. So if I can get more layback, that's going to create more time for me to produce force on the implement. So we want external rotation to some extent, right? Like we can't just add in a ton of external rotation without there being some risk of injuring that joint. So you have to be smart with it. But it's like it's gotten a lot of praise and it's gotten a lot of flack. But it's the same thing if we were looking at a strength training program. Like if we were providing stressors to the athlete without being mindful of what those stressors are going to do, we're probably going to run into some issues down the road. So I think there's a lot of people doing it really, really well, but there's a lot of people doing it really poorly, where it's like, yeah, if you went into the weight room every single day and maxed out on a squat, like you're going to probably run into some issues at some point. So if you go out with a weighted ball and every single time you throw it, it's max intent, you're probably going to run into some issues. So it's just like strength training where periodization comes into play, and like we need to monitor how much we're actually doing with our athletes to make sure we're not harming them in the long run. And I think you definitely need to be strong enough to do that, right? Like baseball in itself, throwing in itself is dangerous. And I think like I heard a great example. Okay, so with like water polo, you can't play water polo until you know how to swim, right? You can play baseball without knowing how to do a push-up and do a row, right? So there's not like things that are preventing kids who are horribly unathletic and unprepared physically from going out and swinging a bat as hard as they can or throwing a ball as hard as they can. Like that is dangerous because you're physically not prepared. So I think definitely like if you can't do a body weight push-up or a body weight squat, we might want to hold off on the velocity program for a little bit, right? Like that should be our focus for now. But once we get those things in place and the athlete is physically prepared and there is an actual plan in place to make sure that we're monitoring stress, then it's great. Like I think there's a ton of positives to it, and people are going to hate on it, but they're going to hate on anything that is different from what they did back in the day.
For sure.
And where it gets a bad rap is a kid will buy a set of weighted balls online with no idea what they're doing. They're just going to go out, like Joe said, just start throwing them. But if they're implemented right, it's just like with any sprint progression or jump progression. Like if it's programmed right and you have it periodized, that's where like there's going to be tremendous benefit.
And it's funny the argument people make about like a baseball being more safe. So baseball is 5 ounces. It's 5 ounces for no reason, right? Like 5 ounces is not safe. It's just 5 ounces because when somebody made a baseball, it became 5 ounces. Nobody knew that was going to be safe for a person to throw. And you see a kid throwing a football, it's a lot heavier than 5 ounces, or a javelin, or a kid's going to go out and just like throw whatever, and he's going to throw a tennis ball too, which is definitely a lot lighter than 5 ounces. So nothing makes a baseball safe, right? Like throwing anything comes with risk, but we just need to monitor what that risk is. So people make the argument of like, just throw a baseball. I'm like, no, that 5 ounces isn't some like magical number that someone created in frickin' 1800 whenever baseball was invented. Like it just came out to be 5 ounces.
That reminds me of a concept I always talk about is like, I just wish that when you go to sign up, like I always talk about for basketball, but like for baseball, if you went to sign up for like a city league, why isn't there a 12-week preparation period where it's like you got to pass these body weight stages, even if it's passing some isometric body weight stages, and just making sure you're in a decent position physically, and then you go into the sport. Because I think people get so much damage at those young ages because they're not actually strong enough to be throwing a ball at that high velocity. And a lot of that, you can't reverse that. Like later on, they get into high school, you get into college, you can go train however smart you want to train. You can't reverse all of that damage. So that's what we see for jumping in basketball. It's like you said, like you don't have to have any movement skills, but you could go out and jump 1,000 times at your weekend tournaments. And it's like the damage to your cartilage, that you're taking of not being able to land. that could probably be prevented with a simple 12-week like lead up period.
Well, and we were actually just talking about this the other day, is everyone's on this hype of like, why are these arm injuries? It's so prevalent nowadays. And growing up in the sport of baseball, there was always those kids that just threw gas at a young age. And the coaches would just throw them. They throw gas. But then we were thinking about it, like, the kids that the parents held them back, they made it to college and obviously there's some kids that still held it back and still got the injury. It's a dangerous action. But it's just that workload. We come back to workload. It's like you have to pull these kids back because it's not just on the sport, at the practice, at the games. Being a young kid, we're outside throwing a football, we're outside throwing rocks, like we're always throwing. So then when they go to the practice or the game and then they're throwing more, it's like you got to take that all into account.
True. And there's with practice and games, I mean, you go out to a field, kid goes out before he throws, he's going to touch his toes a couple times, hamstring, and circle his arm, and then there's no type of warm up, no prep work for the most part.
And like we watch our professional athletes now, and on their throwing programs, and it'll be like guys are going 2-3 weeks without ever getting past 60 yards, right? Or not 60 yards, 60 feet, right? So, but I remember being a 12-year-old and coach first day of practice like, sling it, like just go out as far as you can and throw it as hard. Yeah, long toss first day. And I think it's, I don't want to call it irresponsible, but it's coaches are undereducated on the stress that is placed on the body with that. For
sure.
And it's like what Noel was talking about, like the kid who has the most talent, they also are putting the most stress on their body. Like you need to understand that little Johnny throwing 80 as a 13-year-old is a lot different than a kid who's 13 and he's throwing 60 like the rest of the kids. Like that kid needs special attention and needs you to pull him back because he's putting more stress on his body just because he naturally creates more horsepower.
Right. So are you seeing a shift into kids getting into strength and conditioning younger now, kind of as a result of all the arm injuries, or is it just like, hey, there's a problem, let's not change anything?
I would like to think so.
It's definitely gotten better.
Yeah, I think kids and parents are more bought in. Yeah, then when we were young, yes, compared to when we were young. And I think it's definitely dependent on the city too. It's like, like low income places like don't have grocery stores where they can get high quality foods. It's like the same with that with strength and conditioning, like high quality strength and conditioning. Yeah. Like over the last 3 years, like 4 different facilities have moved into Sacramento that provide really high quality strength and conditioning. Before that, who would a kid go to, right? Like you can go onto Google and maybe find a program that might work for you, but you can also find a lot of bad information.
Yeah, overall, I think when you're like a kid just looking for strength and conditioning, especially when you're looking for affordable strength and conditioning for some of these kids, the strength program does more harm than it does good. They're not complementing the stresses that they're getting through their sport. They're just adding to it. High volume everything, push them hard, make them puke. And it's like we want to think that we prevent injuries, but a lot of times you add to the injuries, which is why it's so necessary to have facilities like you guys where you actually take the time to study the science and you make it about them.
And also, too, I think as more information comes out and people put out online programs like you have where, like, for the most part, somebody can do it at home with just body weight, right? And it's like maybe $30 a month or whatever the case may be. But I think it's just educating parents and players and coaches enough to know the right questions to ask or the right things to look for in a quality program. Because, like, every city has something, some type of program, but it's like somebody with an educated eye would look at that and be like, that's probably not the best fit for you at this age or right now or ever maybe. So I think it's people putting out quality content and then the parents and coaches and players wanting to educate themselves.
100%. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you guys being here. We're going to link some of those videos, some of those demos that we talked about. We'll link in that next video. We'll definitely have to have you guys back on someday.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Thank you,
sir.